The gunshot that killed her husband echoed through the cramped Montana homestead cabin like a death knell for everything Beatrice Reynolds had ever believed about human goodness. She stood frozen in the doorway, basket of eggs still clutched in trembling hands, watching 3 men ride away from her burning barn while Thomas lay sprawled in the dirt, his blood soaking into the earth he had worked so hard to cultivate. The men were neighbors, people they had trusted, people who had smiled at Sunday services and borrowed tools and shared meals at harvest time. But when drought had withered the crops and desperation had set in, those same neighbors had decided that taking what little the Reynolds family had was easier than watching them succeed where others had failed. Beatrice was 23 years old, and in that moment, something fundamental broke inside her, not just her heart, though that shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Not just her sense of safety, though that evaporated like morning dew under a cruel sun. It was her faith in humanity itself, the core belief that people were essentially good, that kindness existed in the world, that trust was something you could afford to give. She buried Thomas alone, unable to bear the thought of asking for help from a community that had harbored his murderers. She sold the homestead for a fraction of its worth to the first buyer who appeared, packed what little she could carry, and left Montana behind with nothing but grief and bitterness as her companions. The year was 1883, and the West was still wild, still untamed, still full of people running from something or searching for something or simply trying to survive. Beatrice fell into that last category, though survival felt more like punishment than salvation. She moved from town to town, taking whatever work she could find, never staying long enough for anyone to get close, never trusting enough to let down her guard. She worked as a laundress in Denver, a seamstress in Cheyenne, a boarding house cook in Salt Lake City. Each job was the same. People would try to befriend her, try to draw her out of her shell, and she would remain distant, polite but cold, always waiting for the moment when they would reveal their true nature, when kindness would give way to cruelty. She saw that cruelty everywhere. The shopkeeper who cheated his customers with weighted scales, the landlord who raised rents on widows who had nowhere else to go, the banker who foreclosed on struggling families with a smile. The world was full of wolves in sheep's clothing, and Beatrice had learned her lesson too well. She would not be fooled again. By the spring of 1884, Beatrice found herself in Independence, California, a small mining town nestled in the Owens Valley with the Sierra Nevada rising majestically to the west. She had taken a job at the general store, tallying accounts and managing inventory for a man named Horace Pembroke, who paid her just enough to rent a tiny room above the saloon and buy basic necessities. The work was monotonous, which suited her fine. Monotony meant predictability, and predictability meant no surprises, no opportunities for betrayal. Independence was rougher than some of the places she had been, populated by miners and ranchers and drifters, men who worked hard and drank harder, who settled disputes with fists or guns and thought little of the consequences. Beatrice kept to herself, walked directly from her room to the store each morning, walked directly back each evening, spoke only when spoken to, and maintained the emotional walls she had built so carefully. It was on a Tuesday in late May when she first encountered Matthew Jameson, though the meeting was hardly auspicious. She was walking to work just after dawn when she heard shouting from the alley beside the bank. Her first instinct was to hurry past, to mind her own business, but something made her pause. The voice doing the shouting was young, frightened, and the responding voices were older, mocking, cruel. Against her better judgment, Beatrice stepped to the mouth of the alley and saw 3 men surrounding a boy who could not have been more than 12 years old. They were pushing him back and forth between them, laughing as he stumbled and nearly fell. "Please, I did not take anything," the boy was saying, his voice cracking with fear. "I was just looking." "Looking is for people who can afford to buy," one of the men sneered. "Dirty little thief." Beatrice should have walked away. She had learned that lesson. Getting involved meant opening yourself up to danger, to complications, to caring about outcomes that were beyond your control. But there was something about the boy's terror that reached past her defenses, something that reminded her of the innocence she had once possessed before the world had taught her that innocence was just another word for foolishness. "Stop," she heard herself say, the word escaping before she could recall it. The three men turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from surprise to amusement. "This does not concern you, lady," one of them said. "Go about your business." "He is just a child," Beatrice said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Let him go." "He is a thief," another man said. "Needs to be taught a lesson." "Did you see him steal anything?" Beatrice asked, stepping closer despite every instinct screaming at her to retreat. The men exchanged glances. "Does not matter what we saw," the first one said. "Matters what we know. His kind are all thieves." The boy was Mexican, Beatrice realized, his skin darker than most of the people in town, his clothes worn and patched. She understood then what was really happening here, and the injustice of it sparked something in her she thought had died with Thomas. "If you did not see him steal, then you are just three grown men bullying a child," she said, her voice sharp, "which makes you cowards, not lawmen." The atmosphere in the alley changed instantly, the mocking humor evaporating into something harder, more dangerous. The largest of the three men took a step toward Beatrice, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "You have a mouth on you, woman. Maybe someone ought to teach you some manners." "I think the lady asked you boys a question." The new voice came from behind Beatrice, deep and calm, with an undercurrent of steel that suggested the speaker was not making an idle observation. She turned to see a man standing at the alley entrance, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dusty trail clothes and a hat that shadowed his face. He had not drawn his gun, but his hand rested casually on the grip, and there was something about his posture that suggested he knew exactly how to use it. "This is none of your concern, Jameson," one of the three men said, but Beatrice noticed that none of them had drawn their weapons, that all three had gone very still. "Seems to me that Miss Reynolds here made it her concern, and when someone is kind enough to stand up for a child, well, that is the sort of concern I am happy to share," the man called Jameson said. His voice remained level, almost friendly, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. "So why do you boys not move along and let the kid be on his way?" There was a long moment of tension, the kind that could break either way into violence or retreat. Then the largest man spat in the dirt and gestured to his companions. "This is not worth the trouble," he muttered, and the three of them pushed past Beatrice and the stranger, their shoulders stiff with wounded pride. The boy did not wait for further invitation. He darted past them all and disappeared down the street like a startled rabbit. The stranger watched him go, then turned his attention to Beatrice, and she finally got a clear look at his face. He was somewhere in his late 20s, she judged, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of creek water, green-brown and surprisingly gentle. There was a scar along his jaw, thin and pale, and his dark hair curled slightly beneath his hat. "You all right, miss?" he asked. "I am fine," Beatrice said, her tone clipped. Now that the immediate danger had passed, she felt foolish for having gotten involved, angry at herself for caring, even for a moment. "Thank you for your assistance." She turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "That was brave, what you did." "It was foolish," Beatrice corrected, not looking back. Bravery and foolishness often look the same. She walked away before he could respond, her heart pounding, her carefully constructed walls feeling suddenly fragile. She did not want his gratitude, did not want to think about why she had intervened, did not want to acknowledge that somewhere deep inside her, beneath all the bitterness and cynicism, there was still a part of her that cared about right and wrong. Over the following days, Beatrice tried to put the incident out of her mind, but Independence was a small town, and word traveled fast. Several people mentioned it to her, some with approval, others with warnings about minding her own business. Horace Pembroke, her employer, gave her a long look when she arrived at work that morning, but said nothing, which she appreciated. She had no desire to discuss her motivations or her actions. What she had not anticipated was that Matthew Jameson would become a regular presence in her life. He owned a small ranch outside of town, she learned, running cattle in the valley and occasionally hiring out his services as a guide for travelers heading into the mountains. He came into the general store 3 days after the alley incident, ostensibly to buy supplies, but Beatrice noticed that he took his time, browsing shelves he must have seen 100 times before, and that his eyes kept drifting toward where she stood behind the counter. "Can I help you find something?" she asked finally, her voice professionally polite. "Just taking inventory of what I need," he said, that same calm tone she remembered from the alley. "Been meaning to stock up before the summer gets too hot." He brought his selections to the counter: coffee, flour, beans, sugar, tobacco, a few tins of peaches. Standard provisions. Beatrice tallied the cost efficiently, wrapped the items, and took his payment. The entire transaction should have been unremarkable, but she was acutely aware of him watching her, not in the way some men watched women, with hunger or calculation, but with something that looked almost like curiosity. "I never properly introduced myself," he said as he gathered his packages. "Matthew Jameson, but most folks call me Matt." "I know who you are," Beatrice said. "Small town." "Fair enough." He smiled slightly, and it transformed his face, softening the hard lines, bringing warmth to those creek water eyes. "Mind if I ask your name, or do I have to wait for the small town gossip to fill me in?" "Beatrice Reynolds," she said despite herself. There was something disarming about his directness, the way he did not try to charm or cajole, just asked straightforward questions and waited for honest answers. "Well, Miss Reynolds, it was a pleasure making your acquaintance, even under unusual circumstances." He tipped his hat and left, and Beatrice told herself that would be the end of it. But he came back, not every day but regularly, always with some plausible reason to visit the store, always polite and respectful, never pushing but always finding some excuse to exchange a few words. Beatrice remained guarded, responding to his pleasantries with the minimum courtesy required, never encouraging further conversation. She had learned not to trust friendly overtures, had learned that people who seemed kind were often just waiting for the right moment to reveal their true colors. Yet as weeks passed, something about Matthew Jameson began to chip away at her certainty. She watched him interact with other people in town, noticed how he treated everyone with the same quiet respect, from the bank president to the Chinese laundry owner that many others openly scorned. She saw him help an elderly woman carry her groceries without being asked, saw him break up a fight outside the saloon with words instead of fists, saw him pay a struggling widow's store bill and tell Horace Pembroke to keep it quiet. These observations did not soften her heart exactly, but they created cracks in the armor she had built. She found herself wondering about him despite her determination not to care, wondering what had brought him to independence, what had put that scar on his jaw, why he lived alone on a ranch when he seemed like the kind of man who should have had a family. It was late June when everything changed. Beatrice was closing the store for the evening, Horace having left early to deal with some family matter, when 4 men entered just as she was turning the lock. She recognized 2 of them as drifters who had been in town for a few days, the kind of men who radiated barely contained violence. The other 2 were locals, troublemakers with reputations for drinking and fighting. "We are closed," Beatrice said, her voice firm despite the sudden spike of fear in her chest. "Do not look closed to me," one of the drifters said, grinning to show tobacco-stained teeth. "Lights are still on, door was open." "I was just leaving," Beatrice said, keeping the counter between herself and them. "You can come back tomorrow." "Thing is, we need some supplies now," the man said, moving closer. "And we heard old Horace keeps the cash box under the counter there. Figure you could help us with that." Beatrice's blood went cold. This was a robbery, and she was alone, and there was no one to help her, just like there had been no one to help Thomas. The old fear and rage rose up in her, bitter and familiar. "I do not have access to the cash box," she lied. "Mr. Pembroke takes it with him." "Now, why do I not believe you?" the man said, his grin widening. His companions had spread out, blocking the door, blocking any escape. "Why do you not just hand it over nice and easy and nobody gets hurt?" Beatrice's hand moved beneath the counter, finding the Derringer Horace kept there for emergencies. It was a small gun, only 2 shots, but it was something. "Get out," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "Get out now, or I will shoot." The men laughed. "You hear that, boys? Little lady thinks she's going to shoot us." "Maybe we need to teach her some manners," one of the others said. "Like we should have taught her back in that alley when she was running her mouth." Beatrice recognized him then as one of the three men who had been harassing the boy. The realization that cruelty was not random but endemic, that the same people would hurt again and again if given the chance, sent a wave of despair through her. This was the world she lived in. This was the truth she had learned. People were cruel, and kindness was a lie, and she was going to die in this store just like Thomas had died in their yard because that was how the world worked. She raised the derringer with both hands, aimed at the nearest man, and pulled the trigger. The gun clicked. Empty or misfired, it did not matter. The result was the same. The men stopped laughing, their expressions turning ugly. "That was a mistake, lady," the leader said, pulling his own gun. "A big mistake." The store's front window exploded inward in a shower of glass, and Matthew Jameson came through it like an avenging angel, gun drawn, eyes blazing with controlled fury. He fired once, the bullet striking the floor inches from the leader's feet, close enough to spray splinters against his boots. "Drop it," Matthew said, his voice colder than Beatrice had ever heard it. "Drop it now, or the next one goes through your knee." "Jameson, this is not your fight," the man protested, but he lowered his gun. "Four armed men threatening a woman alone in a store," Matthew said. "That is everyone's fight. That is the kind of thing that makes decent people ashamed to call themselves human." He moved further into the store, glass crunching under his boots, his gun never wavering. "All of you, guns on the floor, slow and easy. Then you are going to walk out of here and keep walking until you are out of town. If I see any of you in Independence again, I will not be so polite." "You cannot run us out," one of the locals said. "We got rights." "You forfeited your rights when you decided to rob a store and threaten a woman," Matthew said. "Now move before I change my mind and just shoot you all and call it self-defense." There was that same quality Beatrice had heard in the alley, the absolute certainty that he would do exactly what he said. The men must have heard it too, because they dropped their guns and filed out, muttering curses and threats, but going nonetheless. Matthew watched them until they disappeared down the street, then finally holstered his own weapon and turned to Beatrice. She was shaking, she realized, her entire body trembling with delayed reaction. The derringer was still clutched in her hands, her knuckles white with the force of her grip. Matthew crossed to her slowly, his movements careful, non-threatening. "It is all right," he said softly. "They are gone. You are safe." "Safe," Beatrice repeated, and then to her horror, she started to laugh, a bitter, jagged sound that threatened to turn into sobs. "Safe. There is no such thing as safe. Do you not understand that? There are only brief moments between cruelties, spaces where you catch your breath before the next blow falls." "Beatrice," Matthew said, using her first name for the first time, his voice infinitely gentle. "That is not true." "It is true," she insisted, the words tumbling out, months or years of suppressed emotion breaking through the dam. "I have seen it. I have lived it. People are cruel. They take and they hurt and they destroy and they smile while they do it, and there is no stopping them, no changing them. That is the truth. That is the world. That is what was done to you, Matthew said. That does not make it the whole truth." Beatrice looked at him. This man who kept appearing when she needed help, who kept showing kindness when she had convinced herself kindness did not exist, and something inside her cracked. Not broke exactly, but cracked, letting light through for the first time in months. "Why do you keep doing this?" she asked, her voice small and lost. "Why do you keep helping me?" "Because you needed help," Matthew said, as if it were the simplest thing in the world. "Because you stood up for a child when it would have been easier to walk away. Because I have been watching you for weeks, Beatrice, and I see someone who is hurting, someone who has been hurt, And I thought maybe if I could just show you that not everyone is cruel, that not everyone will let you down, maybe that would matter. Tears were sliding down Beatrice's cheeks now, hot and unstoppable. You do not know what happened to me. No, I do not, Matthew agreed, but I know pain when I see it. I know what it looks like when someone has been betrayed so badly they cannot imagine trusting again, and I know what it is like to have your faith in people shattered. What happened to you? Beatrice asked, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. Matthew hesitated, then gestured to the scar on his jaw. Got this in the war. I was 17, lied about my age to enlist, thought I was going to be a hero. Ended up in Andersonville prison camp for the last year of the fighting. You heard of it? Beatrice nodded. Everyone had heard of Andersonville, the Confederate prison camp where thousands of Union soldiers had died of disease and starvation and neglect. I watched men I considered brothers turn on each other over scraps of food, Matthew continued, his voice distant with memory. Watched them steal from the dying, watched them betray each other to the guards for tiny favors. I came out of that place weighing 90 pounds and believing that human beings were fundamentally rotten, that all the talk about honor and brotherhood and decency was just lies we told ourselves. What changed? Beatrice asked. Time, mostly, Matthew said, and people who were patient with me. A doctor who nursed me back to health and never asked for payment. A farmer who gave me work when I was too weak to do much of anything. A woman who ran a boarding house and let me stay for free until I got on my feet. Slowly, bit by bit, they showed me that the worst of humanity does not erase the best of it. That cruelty exists, yes, but so does kindness. That betrayal is real, but so is loyalty. He met her eyes, and Beatrice saw genuine understanding there. Not pity, but recognition. One wounded soul acknowledging another. I am not going to tell you to just get over what happened to you, he said. I am not going to tell you that you should trust everyone or that the world is safe. But I am asking you to consider that maybe, just maybe, the people who hurt you were the exception, not the rule. That there are still good folks in this world. People who will stand beside you instead of tearing you down. I do not know if I can believe that, Beatrice whispered. You do not have to believe it today, Matthew said, but maybe you could consider not disbelieving it so hard. Maybe you could leave just a little room for the possibility. They stood there in the damaged store, surrounded by broken glass and scattered merchandise, and something fundamental shifted between them. Not love, not yet, but the foundation for it, the tentative beginning of connection. I should clean this up, Beatrice said finally, looking at the mess. Let me help, Matthew offered. You do not have to do that. I know I do not have to, Matthew said. I want to. They worked together in comfortable silence, sweeping up glass, righting overturned displays, assessing the damage. It was not extensive, thankfully. The window could be repaired. The merchandise was mostly intact. When everything was as orderly as they could make it, Matthew insisted on walking Beatrice back to her room above the saloon. Those men might still be around, he said when she started to protest. Humor me. The walk was short, just 2 blocks. But Beatrice found herself grateful for his presence, for the solid reassurance of him beside her. When they reached her door, she turned to face him. Thank you, she said, for tonight, for everything. You are welcome, Matthew said. Then carefully, as if approaching a skittish horse, he added, There is a dance next Saturday night at the community hall. I was wondering if you might like to go, with me. Every instinct Beatrice had screamed at her to refuse, to maintain her distance, to not risk opening herself up to potential hurt. But she remembered what he had said about leaving room for possibility, and she thought about how many times he had appeared when she needed help, how consistently he had proven himself trustworthy. All right, she heard herself say, surprising them both. I will go with you. The smile that spread across Matthew's face was like sunrise, warming everything it touched. That is wonderful, he said. I will pick you up at 7. 7 is fine, Beatrice agreed. He tipped his hat and left, and Beatrice let herself into her small room, closed the door, and leaned against it, her heart racing. She had just agreed to go to a dance with a man after swearing she would never let anyone close again. What was she thinking? But she knew what she was thinking. She was thinking about creek water eyes and quiet kindness. She was thinking about someone who had suffered and survived and chosen to become gentle instead of hard. She was thinking that maybe, just maybe, she was tired of being angry and afraid all the time. The week leading up to the dance passed in a strange haze of anticipation and anxiety. Beatrice caught herself thinking about Matthew at odd moments, remembering things he had said, the way he smiled, the steadiness of his presence. She also caught herself spiraling into panic, imagining all the ways this could go wrong, all the ways he could turn out to be like everyone else, all the ways she could end up hurt again. On Thursday, she was restocking shelves when the young Mexican boy she had defended in the alley appeared in the store. He approached her hesitantly, holding something wrapped in cloth. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his English accented but clear. "I am Miguel. You helped me." "I remember," Beatrice said gently. "Are you all right? Those men have not bothered you again?" "No, miss. Mr. Jameson, he told them to leave me alone. He is a good man." Miguel held out the wrapped bundle. "My mother, she wanted you to have this, to say thank you." Beatrice unwrapped the cloth to reveal a beautiful shawl, hand-embroidered with delicate flowers and bright colors. It was clearly a treasured piece, something that had taken hours of work to create. "Miguel, I cannot accept this. It is too much." "My mother insists," Miguel said. "She says you stood up for me when no one else would. She says that is worth more than a shawl." Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes again. Such a small act, speaking up in an alley, and yet it had meant the world to this boy and his mother. Maybe Matthew was right. Maybe small kindnesses did matter. Maybe they accumulated, built up, created something larger than themselves. "Please thank your mother for me," Beatrice said, carefully refolding the shawl. "Tell her it is beautiful, and I will treasure it." Miguel beamed and ran out of the store, leaving Beatrice holding the shawl and feeling something suspiciously like hope stirring in her chest. Saturday arrived with clear skies and warm temperatures. Beatrice spent far too long getting ready, trying on the 3 dresses she owned, and settling finally on a simple blue cotton one that brought out the color of her eyes. She draped the embroidered shawl over her shoulders and studied herself in the small mirror. She looked nervous, she thought, hopeful, vulnerable. All the things she had sworn she would never allow herself to be again. Matthew arrived exactly at 7, cleaned up and dressed in what were clearly his best clothes, his hair still damp from washing. He looked at her for a long moment, and Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks under his gaze. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," Beatrice managed. "You look nice as well." They walked to the community hall together, making awkward small talk about the weather and the town, both of them clearly nervous. The hall was already crowded when they arrived, filled with families and couples, the air thick with the smell of bodies and perfume and the pine boughs that decorated the rafters. A small band was setting up in the corner, tuning their instruments. Beatrice had not been to a dance since before Thomas died, had not allowed herself any sort of social pleasure in all the months since. Being here now, with people laughing and talking around her, with children running between the adults and the promise of music in the air, felt both foreign and achingly familiar, like returning to a home she had thought she would never see again. "Are you all right?" Matthew asked, noticing her expression. "I have not done this in a long time," Beatrice admitted. "We can leave if you want," Matthew offered immediately. "We could take a walk instead or just sit somewhere quiet." The fact that he would give up the dance without hesitation, that her comfort mattered more to him than his own entertainment, decided her. "No," she said, "I want to stay." The music started and couples moved onto the floor. Matthew held out his hand. "May I?" Beatrice placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his fingers as they closed gently around hers. He led her onto the floor and into a simple waltz, and after a moment of awkwardness while she remembered the steps, they found their rhythm. Dancing with Matthew was nothing like dancing with Thomas had been. Thomas had been her childhood sweetheart, comfortable and familiar, like wearing well-broken-in boots. Matthew was new, uncertain, thrilling in a way that made her pulse quicken. He held her carefully, respectfully, but there was an intensity in the way he looked at her that suggested he was as affected by their proximity as she was. "You are a good dancer," Beatrice said, needing to say something to break the tension. "My mother insisted I learn," Matthew said. "Said a gentleman should know how to conduct himself in society even if he planned to spend his life ranching." "Where is your mother now?" Beatrice asked. "Died of fever when I was 15, Matthew said. "Right before I ran off to join the army. My father passed a few years later. I came west after the war, looking for a fresh start." "I am sorry," Beatrice said, "about your parents." "I am sorry too," Matthew said, "about whatever happened to make you so certain people are cruel." Beatrice tensed, but Matthew's hand on her back was warm and steady, and they were surrounded by people, and somehow that made it easier to speak. "I was married," she said quietly, "in Montana. My husband was a good man, a gentle man. We had a homestead, nothing fancy, but it was ours. There was a drought, and people got desperate. 3 of our neighbors, people we had trusted, people we had helped. They came one day while I was gathering eggs. They shot Thomas and burned our barn. I think they meant to take what little we had stored for winter. But I came back before they could. They just rode away and left him there to die." Matthew's steps faltered for just a moment, and when Beatrice looked up, she saw rage flash across his face, followed quickly by something that looked like grief. "Beatrice, I am so sorry. That is unforgivable." "The worst part was that I never saw it coming," Beatrice continued, the words flowing now that she had started. "They seemed like normal people, good people. One of them was a deacon at the church. How do you trust anyone after that? How do you believe in goodness when the people who talk about God on Sunday will murder you on Monday?" "You do not," Matthew said, "not right away. You carry that betrayal, and you watch everyone with suspicion, and you wait for them to reveal their true colors. I know because I did the same thing for years after Andersonville." "What made you stop?" Beatrice asked. "I got tired," Matthew admitted. "Tired of being angry all the time, tired of being alone, tired of letting the worst people I had ever met define how I saw the entire world. And I realized that by doing that, I was letting them win. I was letting their cruelty turn me cruel, their hardness turn me hard. I decided I would rather take the risk of being hurt again than spend the rest of my life behind walls." They danced in silence for a while, the music swirling around them, other couples spinning past. Beatrice thought about what he had said, about choosing to be vulnerable as an act of defiance, about refusing to let cruelty define you. "I am afraid," she said finally. So quietly he had to bend his head to hear her. "I am afraid that if I open up again, if I let myself care, something terrible will happen. That I will pay for that moment of weakness with everything I have." "That is possible," Matthew said, his honesty catching her off guard. "Life does not come with guarantees, Beatrice. People you love can be taken from you. People you trust can betray you. That is the risk you take by being human, by having a heart. But the alternative is being dead inside, going through the motions of life without actually living. And I do not think that is what you want. I do not think that is who you really are." "How do you know who I really am?" Beatrice challenged. "You barely know me." "I know you stood up for a child when 3 armed men were threatening him," Matthew said. "I know you tried to stop 4 robbers with a gun that might not even have been loaded, because letting them get away with it was worse than being afraid. I know you are still here, still standing, still fighting, even after everything that was done to you. That tells me who you are. That tells me you are stronger and braver than you give yourself credit for." Beatrice felt tears threatening again and blinked them back furiously. "I am not brave. I am just too stubborn to quit." "Sometimes those are the same thing," Matthew said, and he smiled at her. that sunrise smile that made her chest ache. The song ended, and another began faster this time, a reel that had people laughing and clapping as they formed sets. Matthew and Beatrice joined in, and the need for conversation disappeared in the whirl of movement. Beatrice found herself laughing for the first time in longer than she could remember, breathless and flushed and feeling almost like herself again, like the person she had been before loss had hollowed her out. They danced 4 more dances, then took a break to get punch and cool down. Other people from town approached them, making conversation, and Beatrice was struck by how easily Matthew interacted with everyone, how genuinely interested he seemed in their lives and concerns. This was not the performance of a manipulator, she realized, not the shallow charm of someone trying to gain advantage. This was simply who he was, someone who cared about his community, who took the time to remember details about people's families and ask follow-up questions about things they had mentioned in previous conversations. As the evening wore on, Beatrice felt the tight knot of fear and suspicion that had lived in her chest for months begin to loosen. Not disappear, not completely, but ease enough that she could breathe more freely. Matthew was doing what he had promised, showing her through consistent action that not everyone was cruel, that some people could be trusted, that kindness was not always a prelude to betrayal. When the dance finally ended and he walked her back to her room, Beatrice found herself reluctant for the evening to finish. "I had a good time tonight," she said at her door. "Thank you for inviting me." "I had a good time too," Matthew said. "I was wondering if maybe you would like to do something again. There is a picnic lunch at the church next Sunday, or we could just take a ride out to my ranch if you prefer something quieter." Beatrice hesitated, the old fear rising up, whispering that she was getting in too deep, moving too fast, setting herself up for disaster. But she pushed it down and said, "I would like to see your ranch, if the offer is genuine." "It is genuine," Matthew assured her. "I promise you, Beatrice, I do not say things I do not mean." She believed him. Against all her instincts and experience, she believed him. "Then yes, I would like that." Matthew's face lit up. "That is wonderful. I will pick you up after church. We can ride out together." "I will be ready," Beatrice said. They stood there for a moment, the air between them charged with potential, with possibility. Then Matthew reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers just brushing her cheek. The touch was feather-light, barely there, but it sent electricity racing through Beatrice's entire body. "Good night, Beatrice. Cheers," he said softly. "Good night, Matthew," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. She watched him walk away, then went inside and sat on her bed, her hand pressed to her cheek where he had touched her, her heart racing. She was falling for him, she realized. Despite everything she had sworn, despite all her walls and defenses, despite the voice in her head screaming warnings, she was falling for Matthew Jameson, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The realization terrified her, but it also, she had to admit, thrilled her in a way she had not felt since Thomas had first courted her all those years ago. This was what being alive felt like, she thought. Not the numb existence she had been settling for, but actual life, with all its risk and promise and terrifying uncertainty. The week passed slowly, each day dragging as Beatrice counted down to Sunday. She found herself thinking about Matthew constantly, remembering the way he had held her while they danced, the way he looked at her like she was something precious, the steady confidence in his voice when he spoke about choosing to trust despite the risks. On Friday, the 4 men who had tried to rob the store returned, drunk and looking for trouble. They cornered Horace Pembroke outside the bank, demanding he withdraw charges he had apparently filed with the circuit judge. A crowd gathered, people watching but no one intervening, and Beatrice felt the old despair rising up. This was the world she knew, the world where might made right and decent people stood by because getting involved meant becoming a target. Then Matthew appeared, along with 2 other ranchers and the town doctor. They formed a solid line between the troublemakers and Horace, and Matthew's voice rang out clear and firm. You boys need to move along. You are drunk. You are disturbing the peace. And if you do not leave right now, we will make you leave. You cannot stop all of us, Enov, one of the drifters said, but he sounded uncertain now, faced with determined opposition instead of frightened compliance. Maybe not, Matthew agreed, but we'll sure make you regret trying. Now you can walk away and leave town, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice. The four men looked at each other, looked at the growing number of townspeople moving to stand behind Matthew and his companions, and apparently decided discretion was the better part of valor. They left, this time for good, and the tension that had gripped Independence dissipated. Beatrice, watching from the store doorway, felt something shift inside her. This was also the world she lived in, she realized. Not just the world of cruelty and cowardice, but the world where people stood up for each other, where men like Matthew gathered others to their side and faced down bullies together. Both worlds existed simultaneously, overlapping, and which one you experienced depended partly on luck and partly on which people you surrounded yourself with. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm. Beatrice attended church services, sitting in her usual spot at the back, and watched Matthew sit with his hat in his hands, his head bowed during the prayers. She wondered what he prayed for, this man who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to believe in its best. She wondered if he prayed for her healing, for her ability to trust again. After the service, Matthew met her outside with 2 horses already saddled. One was his own rangy bay gelding, the other a gentle-looking mare with kind eyes. "This is Daisy," he said, stroking the mare's neck. "She is as steady as they come. I borrowed her from a friend who thought she would be perfect for you." Beatrice had not ridden much since leaving Montana, but the skill came back quickly. She mounted easily, settling into the saddle, and they rode out of town together, heading west toward the mountains. Matthew's ranch was about 5 miles outside Independence, nestled in a little valley with a creek running through it and good grazing land spreading out in all directions. The house was small but well built, made of solid logs with a stone chimney and a wide front porch. There was a barn, a corral, and several outbuildings, all showing signs of careful maintenance. "It is not much," Matthew said as they dismounted, "but it is mine. No debts, no liens. I bought it 3 years ago and have been fixing it up bit by bit." "It is beautiful," Beatrice said honestly. The setting was peaceful, the mountains rising dramatically behind the property, the creek providing a soothing backdrop of sound. "You have done well here." Matthew looked pleased by her assessment. He showed her around, pointing out the improvements he had made, the plans he had for future expansion. His passion for the place was evident in every word, and Beatrice found herself charmed by his enthusiasm. They ate lunch by the creek, sitting on a blanket Matthew had brought, sharing sandwiches and apples and cold water from the stream. The conversation flowed easily, ranging from childhood memories to books they had read to opinions on everything from politics to the best way to make biscuits. Beatrice found herself relaxing in a way she had not since Thomas died, found herself laughing at Matthew's dry observations and sharing stories she had thought she would never want to tell again. "Can I ask you something?" Matthew said after they had finished eating, lying back on the blanket with his hat tipped over his eyes to block the sun. "You can ask," Beatrice said, not committing to answering. "What do you want, Beatrice? Not what you think you should want, not what is safe or sensible, but what you actually want, if you let yourself imagine a future." Beatrice was quiet for a long time, thinking. What did she want? For so long she had only thought in terms of survival, of getting through each day, of not letting anyone hurt her again. But if she was honest with herself, if she pushed past the fear and the grief, what lay underneath? "I want to feel safe," she said finally. "Not safe like nothing bad can ever happen, because I know that is impossible. But safe like I have someone beside me who will face the bad things with me instead of causing them. I want to build something that matters, something that lasts. I want to have a family again, children who grow up knowing they are loved. I want to wake up in the morning and feel something other than dread. I want to be happy." She said the last part almost defiantly, as if happiness were something she had no right to desire. When she looked over at Matthew, he had pushed his hat back and was watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "That does not sound unreasonable to me," he said. "That sounds like exactly what you should want." "What do you want?" Beatrice asked. "Honestly?" Matthew sat up, picked up a piece of grass, and twisted it between his fingers. "I want someone to share this place with. I want to hear laughter in that house instead of just my own footsteps. I want to build something bigger than just a ranch, something like what my parents had before they died. They loved each other, truly loved each other, and that love made everything else possible. I have spent years working this land, and it is good work, satisfying work, but it is lonely. I want what you want, I suppose. Partnership, family, happiness." He looked at her directly, and the vulnerability in his eyes took her breath away. "I want those things with you, Beatrice. I know it is too soon to say that. I know you are not ready to hear it. But I am not going to lie to you or play games. From the moment I saw you standing in that alley, putting yourself at risk for a child you did not even know, I knew you were someone special. And every time I have seen you since has only confirmed it. You are strong and brave and kind underneath all that hurt. And I want to be the person who helps you heal, who stands beside you, who shows you every single day that you can trust me." Beatrice felt like she could not breathe, like the world had narrowed down to just the two of them. This moment, this choice. She could retreat back into her walls, protect herself, play it safe. Or she could take the terrifying leap of trusting someone again, of believing that this time could be different, that this man meant what he said. "I am not healed," she said, her voice shaking. "I am still angry and afraid and damaged. I do not know if I will ever be the person I was before Thomas died." "I am not asking you to be who you were before," Matthew said, moving closer, taking her hand in his. "I am asking you to be who you are now, all of it, the hurt and the strength and everything in between. And I am asking you to let me prove to you day after day that I am worth the risk of trusting." "What if you are not?" Beatrice whispered. "What if I let myself believe in this, in you, and then you turn out to be like everyone else? Then I will have become someone I do not recognize, someone I do not want to be," Matthew said. "But I will not do that, Beatrice. I swear to you on everything I hold sacred, I will not hurt you. I will not betray you. I will stand by you through whatever comes, and I will love you as long as you let me." The tears came then, hot and fast, months of grief and fear and loneliness pouring out. Matthew pulled her into his arms, holding her while she cried, his hand stroking her hair, his voice murmuring soothing nonsense. Beatrice clung to him, letting herself feel all the things she had been suppressing, letting herself acknowledge just how much she had been hurting, how desperately she wanted what he was offering. When the storm finally passed, she pulled back enough to look at him through swollen eyes. "I am a mess," she said, trying to laugh. "You are beautiful," Matthew corrected, using his thumb to wipe away the tears on her cheeks. "And brave. So incredibly brave." "I do not feel brave," Beatrice admitted. "I feel terrified." "That is what makes it brave," Matthew said, "being afraid and doing it anyway." Beatrice took a shaky breath, then another. She thought about everything Matthew had shown her over the past weeks, all the small kindnesses and consistent respect and unwavering support. She thought about the way he had stepped between her and danger without hesitation, the way he had shared his own pain and healing, the way he looked at her like she was something precious. And she made her choice. "All right," she said, "I will trust you. I will try at least. I cannot promise it will be easy, and I cannot promise I would not have moments when I panic or pull away, but I will try." The smile that broke across Matthew's face was like nothing Beatrice had ever seen, pure joy radiating from him. "That is all I ask," he said, "just a chance." He kissed her then softly, carefully, giving her every opportunity to pull away, But Beatrice did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into him, let herself feel the warmth of his lips on hers, the gentle strength of his arms around her. It felt like coming home and stepping into the unknown all at once, terrifying and wonderful and absolutely right. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the ranch, talking and laughing and simply being together. Matthew showed her the vegetable garden he had started, admitted he had no talent for growing things but kept trying. Beatrice told him about the garden she and Thomas had maintained, how she had loved watching things grow, nurturing them from seeds to harvest. "You could plant a garden here," Matthew said carefully, "if you wanted. I mean, even if you were just visiting, you could plant something, but I would like it if you thought of this place as yours too, eventually." It was too soon for that kind of commitment, and they both knew it, but the offer warmed Beatrice nonetheless. To have a garden again, to put her hands in the earth and create life instead of dwelling in death, that appealed to her more than she could say. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, Matthew rode back to town with her. At her door, he kissed her again, longer this time, with more confidence, and Beatrice felt heat curl through her entire body. "Can I see you again?" Matthew asked, "and on tomorrow, if you are free?" "I work during the day," Beatrice said, "but I could have dinner with you tomorrow evening." "I will cook," Matthew offered. "Nothing fancy, but I promise it will be edible." "That sounds perfect," Beatrice said, and meant it. Over the following weeks, they fell into a pattern. Matthew came to town almost every day, finding reasons to visit the store, walking Beatrice home in the evenings, stealing moments together whenever they could. On Sundays, they rode out to the ranch, and Beatrice started the garden she had mentioned, selecting seeds from the store and planning what she would plant where. The more time she spent with Matthew, the more her walls crumbled. He was patient with her fears, understanding when she had bad days, always willing to talk through her concerns. He introduced her to his friends, other ranchers, and townspeople who welcomed her warmly, and Beatrice began to build a community in independence, to put down roots for the first time since fleeing Montana. There were setbacks. One evening, a man in the saloon made a crude comment about Beatrice as she walked past, and she panicked, convinced that this was the beginning of the cruelty she had been waiting for. Matthew handled it calmly, confronting the man and extracting an apology, then holding Beatrice while she cried from sheer reaction. "I am sorry," she said, furious with herself. "I am being ridiculous." "You are healing," Matthew corrected. "That is not ridiculous. That is necessary." Another time, Beatrice learned that one of the shopkeepers in town had been cheating elderly customers, and she spiraled, convinced that this proved people were fundamentally bad. Matthew listened to her rant, then gently pointed out that the community had discovered the cheating and dealt with it, that the shopkeeper had been forced to make restitution and had lost most of his business as a result. "Bad people exist, Ramones," he said, "but so do consequences. So do communities that look out for each other. You cannot just see the bad, Beatrice. You have to look at the whole picture." It was hard, retraining her mind to notice the good as well as the bad, but Beatrice tried. She noticed when Horace gave credit to struggling families. She noticed when the doctor treated patients who could not pay. She noticed when neighbors helped each other with barn raisings and harvest and child care. The cruelty was still there, still visible, but it no longer seemed like the only truth, the only reality. By late summer, Beatrice realized she had fallen completely in love with Matthew Jameson. It had happened gradually. A slow accumulation of moments and kindnesses and shared laughter, until one morning she woke up and the thought of life without him was unbearable. The realization still frightened her, but the fear was manageable now, balanced by trust and hope. They were working in the garden together one Sunday in early September, the autumn air crisp and clear, when Matthew suddenly set down his tools and turned to her. "Beatrice, I need to ask you something," he said, and there was a seriousness in his tone that made her look up. "What is it?" she asked. "I love you," Matthew said simply. "I have loved you for months now, and I'm tired of not saying it. I love your strength and your vulnerability, your kindness and your fierce protectiveness, the way you laugh when you let yourself forget to be afraid. I love who you are and who you are becoming, and I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, if you will let me." He pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small stone set into it. "This was my mother's," he said. "It is not fancy, but it is all I have to offer, along with my heart and this ranch and a promise that I will spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust. Beatrice Reynolds, will you marry me?" Beatrice stared at the ring, her mind racing. This was what she had wanted, she realized. This was the future she had been afraid to imagine, the happiness she had thought was lost to her forever. And it was being offered by a man who had proven himself over and over, who had shown her that love did not have to end in betrayal, that trust could be rewarded instead of punished. "Yes," she said, the word bursting out of her. "Yes, Matthew, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, settling into place like it had been made for her. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her with a passion that took her breath away. And Beatrice kissed him back, pouring into it all the love and trust and hope she had been building over these months. They were married in October on a crisp day with gold leaves falling from the cottonwoods and the mountains sharp and clear against a brilliant blue sky. The ceremony took place in the Independence Church, with what seemed like the entire town in attendance. Miguel and his mother came, with his mother crying happy tears throughout. Horace Pembroke gave Beatrice away, having become something of a surrogate father to her. Several of Matthew's rancher friends stood up with him, and the doctor's wife stood up with Beatrice. As she walked down the aisle toward Matthew, Beatrice thought about how far she had come from the broken woman who had arrived in Independence barely a year earlier. She had been so certain that people were cruel, that trust was foolish, that she would spend the rest of her life alone and guarded. But Matthew had shown her something different, not through grand gestures or empty promises, but through consistent kindness, through patience with her fears, through choosing every single day to be gentle and trustworthy and true. Matthew watched her approach with such love in his eyes that Beatrice felt her throat tighten with emotion. When she reached him, he took her hands, and the minister began the ceremony. They spoke their vows clearly, firmly, promising to love and honor and cherish each other through whatever came. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Matthew kissed her with a tenderness that promised forever. The reception was held at the community hall, with food and music and dancing. Beatrice wore the embroidered shawl Miguel's mother had given her, and several people commented on how beautiful it was. She danced with Matthew, with Horace, with several of the other ranchers, and she laughed and smiled until her face hurt from the sheer joy of it. "Are you happy?" Matthew asked her during a quiet moment, both of them standing on the porch getting fresh air. "I am happier than I thought possible," Beatrice admitted. "A year ago, I did not think I would ever feel anything but pain again, and now look at me, married, smiling, surrounded by friends. It is like a miracle." "Not a miracle," Matthew said, pulling her close. "Just the natural result of letting yourself heal, of giving people a chance, of choosing to believe that good things are possible." "You make it sound so simple," Beatrice said. "The concept is simple," Matthew agreed. "The doing is hard. But you did it, Beatrice. You did the hard thing. You let yourself trust again, even when every instinct told you not to. That took more courage than most people have in their entire lives." They moved into the ranch house together, and Beatrice threw herself into making it a home. She sewed curtains for the windows, planted more flowers around the house, organized the kitchen the way she liked it. Matthew built her a bookshelf for the small collection of volumes she had accumulated, and they spent evenings reading by the fire, Matthew working on ranch accounts while Beatrice lost herself in novels. The first winter was hard, not because of their relationship, but because the snows came heavy and early, isolating them for weeks at a time. But those weeks taught Beatrice something important. She learned that being snowed in with Matthew was not suffocating but comforting, that she enjoyed his constant presence, his quiet competence, the way they worked together to manage the livestock and keep the house warm. She learned that she was no longer afraid of depending on someone because Matthew had proven he could be depended on. Spring brought new beginnings. Beatrice discovered she was pregnant in April, and the news filled her with a complicated mixture of joy and terror. She had always wanted children, had dreamed of them with Thomas, but she had also learned how quickly happiness could be torn away. Matthew sensed her fear and addressed it head on. "Nothing is guaranteed," he told her, holding her hands and looking into her eyes. "Our child could get sick, or there could be complications, or any number of things could happen, but we could also have a healthy baby who grows into a wonderful person, and we could watch them grow up and have a good life. We cannot let fear of what might happen stop us from embracing what is happening." Beatrice held on to those words throughout her pregnancy, repeating them to herself when anxiety threatened to overwhelm her. And as her body changed and the baby grew inside her, she found herself feeling something she had not experienced in years: genuine, uncomplicated excitement about the future. Their son was born in December, a week before Christmas, during a break in the winter storms. The labor was long and difficult, but Matthew stayed by her side the entire time, holding her hand, wiping her forehead, murmuring encouragement. When the baby finally arrived, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Beatrice held him and wept with joy. "What should we name him?" Matthew asked, looking at his son with wonder. "James," Beatrice said, thinking of Matthew's last name, of this legacy they were creating together. James Matthew Jameson. "That is a lot of names that sound alike," Matthew said with a laugh. "But I love it. Welcome to the world, James." Raising a baby on a ranch was challenging, but Beatrice discovered she loved motherhood, loved watching her son grow and change, loved seeing Matthew transform into a devoted father. He would come in from working the cattle and immediately seek out James, talking to him in a soft voice, telling him stories about the ranch and the mountains and all the things they would do together when James was older. When James was 6 months old, Miguel came to the ranch with news. His family was moving to Los Angeles, where his father had found steady work. They wanted to say goodbye and to thank Beatrice again for what she had done. "You changed our lives," Miguel's mother said in careful English. "You stood up for my son when no one else would. You showed us that there are good people in this world, people who will do the right thing even when it is hard. We will never forget that." Beatrice hugged her, feeling the circle complete. She had learned that lesson herself from Matthew, and now she had passed it on to others. That was how goodness spread, she realized. Not through grand gestures, but through small acts of courage and kindness that rippled outward, touching lives in ways you might never fully understand. Years passed, filled with the rhythms of ranch life. There were hard times. A drought one summer that killed half their cattle, a winter so brutal they lost several outbuildings, a year when beef prices plummeted and they barely scraped by. But there were far more good times: successful cattle drives, beautiful harvests from the garden, neighbors helping neighbors, community celebrations, quiet evenings on the porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Beatrice and Matthew had 2 more children, a daughter they named Mary when James was 3, and another son named Robert when Mary was 2. The house that had been so quiet when Beatrice first saw it was now full of noise and laughter and the controlled chaos of children. Beatrice sometimes looked around at her life and could barely believe it was real, that she had somehow gone from broken and bitter to happy and whole. "Do you ever think about Montana?" Matthew asked her one evening when the children were in bed and they were sitting on the porch watching the stars come out. "Sometimes," Beatrice admitted, "but not the way I used to. It does not hurt as much anymore. Thomas was a good man and I loved him, and he deserved better than what happened to him. But I have learned that carrying that pain forever would not honor his memory. Living well, loving our children, building a good life, that is the better tribute." "He would have wanted you to be happy," Matthew said. "I think he would," Beatrice agreed. "And I am. Matthew, I'm so happy. There are still hard days, still moments when I remember what cruelty looks like, but they do not define my life anymore. You taught me that. You showed me that the world has room for both cruelty and kindness, and which one you experience depends largely on who you surround yourself with." You taught me things too, Matthew said. You reminded me why I chose to believe in goodness in the first place. You reminded me that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to be vulnerable despite it. Loving you has made me a better man, Beatrice. They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. In the distance, a coyote called, and closer, an owl hooted softly. The children slept safely in their beds, the cattle were settled in the pastures, and the mountains stood eternal and unchanging against the night sky. James grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch and learned everything Matthew could teach him about cattle and horses and the land. Mary was fearless and curious, always exploring, always asking questions, keeping Beatrice constantly occupied. Robert was the baby, sweet-natured and affectionate, content to follow his older siblings and imitate everything they did. By the time James was 10, he was already a capable ranch hand, working alongside Matthew during the busy seasons. Beatrice watched them together and saw the same patience and kindness in Matthew's teaching that he had shown her in their early days. He never got frustrated when James made mistakes, never raised his voice or made his son feel inadequate. Instead, he explained things clearly, demonstrated when necessary, and praised effort as much as success. "You are a good father," Beatrice told him one evening after James had successfully helped deliver a calf. "I'm trying to be the father I wish I'd had longer," Matthew said. "Someone who makes his kids feel capable and loved, who teaches them not just skills but values. I want our children to grow up knowing they can trust people, that the world has good in it, that kindness matters." "They are learning that," Beatrice assured him. "How could they not? With you as an example." The children did learn those lessons. James grew into a kind young man who helped neighbors without being asked and stood up for younger kids who were being bullied. Mary became known for her generosity, always sharing her toys and treats with children who had less. Robert, though still young, showed signs of inheriting his father's gentle nature. One summer day when James was 15, he came home with a story about seeing some men harassing a Chinese family that had recently moved to town. "I did what you would have done, Pa," James said. "I told them to stop. And when they would not, I went and got Sheriff Morrison. He ran them off." Matthew looked at his son with unmistakable pride. "That took courage, James. Standing up to bullies always does. But it was the right thing to do, and I am proud of you." Beatrice, listening from the kitchen, felt tears prick her eyes. This was the legacy they were creating, she realized. Not just a ranch or a business, but children who understood that how you treat people matters, that kindness is not weakness, but strength, that standing up for others is always worth the risk. As the years continued to pass, Beatrice and Matthew watched their children grow and their ranch prosper. They added more land, built a bigger barn, improved their herd. But the real measure of their success was not in acres or cattle, but in the life they had built together, the family they had created, the love that filled every corner of their home. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Matthew took Beatrice back to the spot by the creek where they had picnicked on that first visit to the ranch. They were older now, both showing gray in their hair, their faces lined with years of hard work and laughter. But when Matthew looked at her, Beatrice saw the same love in his eyes that had been there on their wedding day. 20 years, Matthew said, holding her hands. 20 years since you took a chance on me, on us. "Best decision I ever made," Beatrice said. "You gave me back my life, Matthew. You showed me that I did not have to let what happened to me define who I became. You proved that love was worth risking everything for." "We proved it to each other," Matthew corrected. "You had just as much faith in me as I had in you. You could have stayed closed off forever, but you chose to open up, to trust, to love. That was all you, Beatrice." They stood by the creek, the same mountains rising behind them, the same water flowing past, and Beatrice thought about everything that had happened since that first frightened arrival in Independence. She had been so broken then, so convinced that people were cruel and trust was foolish. But Matthew had shown her something different, had proven through consistent action and unwavering love that good people existed, that kindness was real, that faith could be rewarded. More importantly, she had learned that healing was possible, that you could survive terrible betrayal and still open your heart again, that the wounds inflicted by cruel people did not have to be permanent. It took courage and time and patience, but it was possible to move from brokenness to wholeness, from fear to trust, from despair to joy. James took over more of the ranch responsibilities as he got older, proving himself as capable and hardworking as his father. Mary surprised everyone by developing a talent for breeding horses, turning it into a profitable side business. Robert, the youngest, showed an aptitude for numbers and helped manage the ranch accounts as he grew. When James was 20, he married a girl from a neighboring ranch, a kind young woman named Sarah, who Beatrice welcomed into their family with open arms. The wedding was held at the ranch, with the whole community attending, and as Beatrice watched her son exchange vows, she thought about how far they had all come, how much had changed since that terrible day in Montana. Mary married at 22 to a veterinarian who had moved to Independence to set up practice. Robert, always the scholar, went to Sacramento to study law, though he promised to return and use his education to help the ranching community. Beatrice missed him terribly when he left, but she was proud of his ambition and determination. As grandchildren began to arrive, Beatrice found new joy in watching the next generation grow. James and Sarah had 3 children in quick succession, filling the ranch with young voices and laughter. Mary had 2, and even Robert, who had settled in town after completing his studies, had a son and daughter. Beatrice was in her late 50s now, her hair more gray than brown, her hands showing the work of decades on the ranch, but she was healthy and happy, surrounded by family, secure in the love she shared with Matthew. They sat on their porch one evening, watching their grandchildren play in the yard while the sun set behind the mountains, and Beatrice realized that this was what she had wanted all along, this sense of peace, this feeling of being rooted and connected, this knowledge that she had built something lasting and good. "What are you thinking about?" Matthew asked, noticing her contemplative expression. "Everything," Beatrice said. "How far we have come, how good this life is, how grateful I am that you did not give up on me when I was so determined to push everyone away." "I saw who you really were underneath all that hurt," Matthew said. "I saw your strength and your goodness, and I knew that if I could just be patient enough, consistent enough, you would find your way back to trusting. And you did, Beatrice. You did the hardest thing in the world. You chose to love again despite every reason not to." "We both did," Beatrice said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "We both chose to believe that the cruelty we had experienced was not the whole story, that there was still room in the world for kindness and trust and love. And we were right." "We were right," Matthew agreed, wrapping his arm around her. "And look at what we built because of it." They watched their grandchildren play, watched the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, watched the day give way to evening. Inside the house, they could hear their children and their spouses getting ready for dinner, the comfortable sounds of family gathering together. The ranch stretched out around them, prosperous and peaceful, a testament to decades of hard work and careful stewardship. This was her legacy, Beatrice thought, not just the ranch or the family, though those were important. Her real legacy was showing that healing was possible, that cruelty did not have to destroy you, that love could triumph over fear. She had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to her and refused to let it define her. With Matthew's help, she had transformed pain into wisdom, fear into courage, isolation into connection. Years continued to pass, marked by seasons changing and children growing in the steady rhythm of ranch life. Matthew's health began to decline as he entered his 70s, his joints stiff with arthritis, his movements slower than they once were. But his mind remained sharp, his love for Beatrice as strong as ever, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. Beatrice cared for him tenderly, the way he had cared for her when she was emotionally wounded. She helped him when his body would not cooperate, read to him when his eyes grew tired, sat with him for hours just talking about their life together, remembering all the moments that had brought them to this point. "I have no regrets," Matthew told her one evening when they both knew he did not have much time left. "This life with you, it has been everything I could have wanted. You made me so happy, Beatrice. You gave me a family and a purpose and love that sustained me through everything. I could not have asked for more." "You gave me the same," Beatrice said, her voice breaking. "You gave me back my faith in humanity. You showed me that not everyone is cruel, that trust can be rewarded, that love is worth the risk. You saved me, Matthew. In every way a person can be saved." Matthew died peacefully in his sleep on a spring morning, surrounded by family, with Beatrice holding his hand. She grieved deeply, mourned the loss of the man who had been her partner and lover and best friend for more than 40 years. But this grief was different from the grief she had felt when Thomas died. This grief was clean, untainted by betrayal or bitterness. It was the natural sorrow of losing someone beloved, the pain that came from having loved deeply and been loved in return. At Matthew's funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives he had touched. Ranchers and townspeople, children he had helped, families he had supported, all came to pay their respects. Person after person stood up to share stories of Matthew's kindness, his integrity, his willingness to help without expecting anything in return. Beatrice listened and felt proud, grateful that she had shared her life with such a remarkable man. In the weeks and months following Matthew's death, Beatrice was sustained by her family and her community. Her children and grandchildren rallied around her, making sure she was never alone, helping her manage the ranch, keeping her connected to life. She found comfort in continuing the work she and Matthew had built together, in maintaining the values they had instilled in their children, in watching their legacy continue through the next generations. On what would have been their 45th wedding anniversary, Beatrice walked out to the creek where Matthew had proposed, where they had shared so many quiet moments together over the years. She sat on the bank and looked out at the mountains and thought about everything they had experienced together. "Thank you," she said aloud, speaking to Matthew's memory, to the universe, to whatever force had brought them together. "Thank you for showing me that my faith could be restored, that people could be trusted, that love was worth believing in. Thank you for being patient when I was difficult, understanding when I was afraid, constant when I needed stability. Thank you for loving me so well." The creek burbled past, the same water that had flowed here on that first visit, on their anniversary picnics, on countless ordinary days. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging, witnessing human joy and sorrow with equal indifference. But Beatrice did not feel indifferent. She felt grateful, blessed, complete. She had lived a good life, she realized. She had survived terrible cruelty and found her way back to trust. She had loved and been loved. She had raised children and watched them become good people. She had built something lasting with Matthew, something that would continue long after she was gone. Her faith had indeed been shattered by cruel people, but Matthew Jameson had shown her, through thousands of small actions and decades of unwavering devotion, that not everyone was cruel. He had shown her that goodness existed, that kindness was real, that love could heal even the deepest wounds, and in doing so, he had given her the most precious gift possible, the ability to hope again, to trust again, to open her heart again despite all the reasons not to. Beatrice lived to the age of 83, active and engaged until the end, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even great-grandchildren. When she died peacefully in her sleep, she was laid to rest beside Matthew in the Independence Cemetery, their graves overlooking the valley they had both loved so much. At her funeral, her grandson James, named for her late husband, stood to speak about his grandmother's legacy. "She taught us that cruelty does not have to define you," he said, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "She showed us that healing is possible, that faith can be restored, that love is always worth the risk." She survived the worst humanity has to offer and chose to believe in the best of it anyway. That is her gift to us, her legacy, not to be naive about the world, but to remain open to goodness despite knowing evil exists, to trust carefully but genuinely, to love fully despite the possibility of loss. She lived those values every day of her life, and she taught them to all of us. The ranch continued to prosper under the management of her descendants, each generation adding their own contributions while maintaining the core values Beatrice and Matthew had established. The community hall in Independence eventually bore a plaque commemorating Beatrice's contributions to the town, her willingness to stand up for others, her example of grace and strength in the face of adversity. But her real memorial was not made of bronze or stone. It was the family she had created, the children and grandchildren who carried forward her lessons about kindness and courage. It was the community bonds she had helped strengthen through her example. It was the lives she had touched, directly and indirectly, by choosing to believe in goodness, despite every reason not to. In the end, Beatrice Reynolds Jameson's story was one of transformation. She had arrived in Independence broken and bitter, convinced that people were fundamentally cruel, that trust was foolishness, that she would spend the rest of her life alone and guarded. But through Matthew's patient love and consistent kindness, she had learned that her faith could be restored, that not everyone would betray her trust, that opening her heart was not weakness but courage. She had discovered that healing was possible, that the wounds inflicted by cruel people could scar over and fade, that you could build a new life even after the old one had been destroyed. She had learned that love was worth risking everything for, that family and community were treasures beyond price, that choosing hope over despair was the bravest act of all. And in learning those lessons herself, she had taught them to others, creating ripples that spread far beyond her immediate circle. Every child she raised, every person she helped, every act of kindness she performed contributed to making the world a little less cruel, a little more hopeful, a little more loving. That was her victory, her triumph over the terrible events that had once shattered her faith. She had not let cruelty have the final word. She had not allowed betrayal to close her heart permanently. Instead, with Matthew's help, she had found her way back to trust, back to love, back to life. And in doing so, she had proven that even the deepest wounds could heal, that even the darkest despair could give way to joy, that faith once shattered could be painstakingly rebuilt, stronger and more resilient than before. The mountains still stood over the Owens Valley, eternal witnesses to human struggle and triumph. The creek still ran through what had been Beatrice and Matthew's ranch, now managed by their great-grandchildren, and the lessons they had taught about kindness and courage and the power of love to overcome even the cruelest circumstances lived on in everyone whose lives they had touched, an enduring legacy that would continue for generations to come.